Hi guys, and welcome to our continuation of our table view series. In this particular tutorial, we're going to take a look at an application, or rather, we're going to create an application that uses a navigation controller. Now, you might have seen these in use in a bunch of different applications. I've got one example up on screen, and this is actually what we're going to be creating. So you'll notice that I've created a table view that has a list of some of the characters that I love from Star Wars. Now you'll notice that it has a detailed disclosure indicator next to the row, and if I were to click on a particular item in the row, it loads another view with a picture of that particular character and then of course their name in there. So let's take a look at how we can create this application using xCode and take a look at what Apple offers us as sort of standard code within the template itself, and how we can modify that to do something like this. So of course this is a very simplistic application. Like I said, you can leverage this particular model and really load in just about anything you want using this navigation controller and table view format. So let's get started. To do that, one of the first things I want to point out, of course, is the version of xCode that I'm on. I am currently running version 4.3.1, and this is important because in previous versions of xCode, you'll notice a template type called navigation controller. And let's take a look at that. I'm going to first create a new project. So I'm just going to go File, New, Project, of course. And it's going to ask me to name that project. So let me go ahead and do that. But before I do that, I'm asked to select a template for my project. And this is what I was referring to earlier. You'll notice that, of course, I am under the iOS section. I've got application selected, and I get a bunch of different template options. The one that we're actually going to use is called this master detail application. And it has a little bit of a description here that tells you about how this application is going to be set up. So you'll see that it talks about having a navigation controller, and if you're on an iPad, it can also have a split view. So I had mentioned a second ago that I was in version 4.3, and that's important because the templates have sort of changed over the last couple of versions of xCode. So if you were maybe 3 or 4 versions ago, you would have noticed, if you were running that particular version of xCode, you'll notice that there was a template called navigation controller, and that's actually the template we would have normally used. But since xCode's been updated, we actually want to use this one called master detail application. So let's select that, hit next. Here I'm asked to define my product name. I'm just going to call this Star Wars because that's the name of sort of what we're trying to accomplish here. You'll also notice that there is one option checked here. This is automatic reference counting, and this is sort of a newer feature within xCode. And what this sort of relates to is if you remember in the past, when you've created new objects within your code, you've had to remember to release them. Well, automatic reference counting, or ARC, takes care of that for you, and you actually don't have to include a bunch of these different statements to release the object, or even really keep track of when to release it. So it makes writing the code a little bit easier, but it also means that there are certain things that you may be used to doing, such as issuing retain commands or release commands, that you can no longer do once this is checked. So we'll keep that checked, hit next. It's of course going to ask me where I want to save it, and I am going to create it right here, and we'll see what it does. And here we go, we've got our project created. Great. So with this project file open, let's actually just run it and see what it actually does. So I'm going to hit run, and in a second we should see this application get loaded in our simulator. I'll give it a couple seconds here. Just about there. It's compiling the nib files, and here we go. It's just about ready to run this application for us. So let me pull up the simulator, and it's loading up. And here we go. So this is what we get from Apple out of the box. You'll notice that there is there's sort of a title bar here. There's 2 buttons, but there's nothing actually in our table view here on screen. That's because the way this application is set up, you can actually edit this table view on the fly. So if I were to hit this plus button, you'll notice that it inserts the timestamp and gives me a detailed disclosure indicator. So I can click on that, and then I'm shown sort of a detailed view with that exact same timestamp value. Let me go back. I can add more of these if I like, and I can each time click on it and see a detail view. So this is pretty cool. It's pretty powerful code, but it's a little bit more complicated than we want to get in terms of sort of a starting navigation controller application. It also has the ability to do edits and things like that, and I can delete rows. So this is fantastic. But like I said, it's a little too complicated for being a starting navigation controller based application, and I think our example where we had this particular setup where we've got a table view and a bunch of different rows is a little bit simpler, and I think will help you leverage this concept a little bit more in terms of your own applications. So let's get started. One of the first things I'm going to do is to make it easier for you to see my code is I'm going to go to Edit within the xCode window itself and go to, xCode Preferences, and I'm going to change the formatting so you can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to switch to presentation mode, which should make life a little bit easier. And I'm going to close that, and now I can go to my code files, and you should see really nice large fonts for you to be able to see this on YouTube. Right, so what do we actually have out of the box? So let's take a look. We've got an appdelegate.h and an appdelegate.m, which is the header and implementation files. We've got a pair of files for the master view controller, and also one set for the detail view controller. So the master view controller is that first table view that we actually see. And then when we click on this, it's actually loading another view controller, which is the detail view controller. So that being said, let's take a look at the nib files themselves, or the xib files. So here's our master view controller. If I click on it, you see the standard table view, and there's nothing else here. If I switch to the detail view controller, you'll notice that there is just a standard view, and then there's this one object on the screen, which is actually a UI label. And this is what actually displays the values when we click on them. So that being said, let's get started making some modifications. So one of the first things we're actually going to do is I am going to drag this down just a little bit to make some room, and I am going to add a Uiimageview. If you remember, in our standard application, when I clicked on a row, it loaded in the view controller, and it had the image of that particular character, and then here was the text, which is our label with the name of the character in it. So to accomplish that, we have to import or add a Uiimageview to our existing view. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Uiimageview search here in our objects library. I find it, and then I simply just drag this onto my screen. And if it doesn't fill it completely for you, you can always just bring it up to one corner, grab it, and then just grab these controls to maximize it. Right. So you'll notice, of course, that the way I've got it set up, when I click on it, it immediately selects the image view, which is fine, no problem there. But I may want to manipulate the label itself, so it's probably a little bit smarter for me to move this in terms of order. So you'll notice that the bottommost item appears at the top. We just want to drag this and move it down, so now we can actually access both. So I can click on this, get to the image view. I can click on this item and get to the label. Now, one of the things we actually have to do is connect our objects here in Interface Builder to the instance variables, or to the outlets that we define within our view controller files. So I just added this image view, so I actually have to go back into my detail view controller .h file, and here I will need to add a new IB outlet. So one of the things that you may notice is a little bit different is the fact that we no longer have code in here that looks something like this. So in the past, when you were defining your class here, when you were creating instance variables, you would probably do something like, let's say, take this one as an example. I would probably have created an instance variable here called ID, detail item, and then I would, to be able to get to the setters and getters, to get those, I would create this add property and add synthesized values. So you'll notice that when I add this particular additional code, xCode doesn't actually throw any errors. That's because this is correct code. Now, what is interesting, of course, is that there's a move with a lot of developers and they've essentially stopped adding these explicit definitions of instant variables. In fact, what they do instead is just use this app property value, because it turns out that this statement is enough to create the instance variable and also set up the setters and getters. So it's sort of a time-saving measure, but if you've never seen it before, it can get a little bit confusing. So what I want to do here is, of course, remember we created that Uiimageview, so I have to actually create an outlet. Now, if you've worked with application design within iOS, you've of course know what an outlet is. For those of you that don't, remember that when you create drag an object onto your screen in Interface Builder, if you want to be able to interact with that object, that is, you want to maybe change the value, change the color, you have to create an outlet, and that outlet is essentially a connection to that particular object. So here what we're going to do is I'm going to create an outlet. I'm going to say at property strong non-atomic, and then I am going to go ahead and create the object. So let's say the instance variable, let's say, so this is a Uiimageview, and I'm just going to call it picture. And one item that I actually left off here is I forgot to explicitly say that this was an IB outlet, so all I have to do is come back here, say IB outlet, and here we are, we've got this particular thing in place. Now remember, if you want to create setters and getters for a particular instance variable, you do have to create an at property statement, but you also have to include its corresponding at synthesized value. So let's jump back and let's go back here, and you'll notice that there's a bunch of at synthesized values. I'm going to go ahead and add one for our latest one, which was called picture. And then you'll notice that there's something interesting going on here. We've got similar synthesized statements for some of the other instance variables, but what's this interesting sort of setup where it says at synthesized detail item is assigned the value of underscore detail item? Well, this particular syntax is simply a way for us to determine or to explicitly okay, I'm going to recant that. It's not a way to really explicitly define something, but it is sort of a best practice model where whenever you see a variable name that begins with an underscore, it's assigned that this is sort of an instance variable. So if I were to go back here and say at synthesized picture, if I were to follow that same model, what I might do is say something like this. And you'll notice that as we scroll through the code, you'll notice that instead of referring to this particular instance variable as detail item, it's always referred to as underscore detail item. So this is just like I said, one of those best practice things. I don't actually have it to do it this way, but since I've noticed that starting with the latest versions of xCode, Apple has begun to use this sort of setup, I'm going to follow the same. So hopefully this makes things a little bit clearer if you see it in other sample code. So our next step from here, of course, is to also eliminate some of the extraneous code that we're not going to need. So one of the there's a bunch of objects in this particular view controller file, and one of the ones that we are not going to need is this particular method here. It says set detail item colon, and what we're going to do is actually just go ahead and comment it out. You'll notice that what it essentially is doing is it's checking to see if the current view controller is it's comparing essentially that detail item value and then setting it to a new value. And then it also calls this method called self-configure-view. But because we're not going to need it, we're just going to go ahead and comment it out. We can of course delete it if we like, but I typically tend to comment out things because it's easier to go back if you need to. Now we'll notice that we do have this next method, which is called configure-view, and we can't actually eliminate this method like we did this one, because even though we've eliminated this first method, which is set detail item, and it called configure view, there's actually a Viewdidload method down here that also calls the same method. So we have to leave this particular one intact, but we are going to remove this particular code because we're going to replace it in just a few minutes with some different code that does essentially the same thing. So we're going to hit Command S to save that. Let's keep coming down. We see a Viewdidload method, and this looks good. Viewdidunload looks good as well. Scroll down, everything looks good here. So we're set for now within this detail view controller implementation file. Next, we're going to move to our master view controller.h file. Let's click on that. In here, we're going to want to introduce a new instance variable, and it's going to be an NSArray object. So let's go ahead and do that, and I'll tell you why in just a second here. So let's go ahead and create our NSArray. So we go at property strong non-atomic, and let's say NSArray, create an object, and we just call it list, and of course we have to also implement the @synthesized statement to be able to really fully implement the setter and getter. So we've got an @synthesized statement here. So let's just go ahead and, as usual, let's create our list, and we'll set that to be equal to _list. Very good. So once that's done, we're going to slowly make our way through the various methods that are on this page, and from there either implement some additional code or take out some of the code that xCode or Apple already provided for us. So one of the things we're going to do here, of course, is you'll notice that in this first method, which is the init with nibname : bundle, there is a block of code where we're setting the title. So we're going to go ahead and change this. As you can see, it says self.title is set to the NS localized string, and we're going to change this so that it just uses a simple NS string value for the title. So we'll just say self.title is equal to Star Wars. So we can set it to a NS string value. Nice and easy there. Then we're going to hit Command S and save that, and just keep moving down the list so we can edit out some of this code here. So you'll notice that in this Viewdidload method, there's some code where it's setting a left bar button item. Then it also declares a button called add button, and then it'll set the add button as the right item. So one of the things we're going to do here is we're not going to need any of this, but we do need the Viewdidload method. So let's go ahead and comment out all of this code since we don't really need it. Go ahead and comment all of this out, and there we go. That's completed. We're next going to keep moving down the list here. Let's take a look. What else do we need to do? Oh, before we jump to any more methods, I guess one of the things we should probably do is implement that NSArray object that we created. So if you remember, we created an NSArray instance variable called list, and we're going to refer to it using its instance variable name. So that's _list. We're going to say let's allocate some memory to it, and it is an NSArray, so we go NSArray alloc. Once that's there, we can say init with objects. That's the method we want to initialize with, and it takes a list of well, it takes a list of objects, and we can set that to be a list of NSString objects. So we'll just set it to things like we'll say maybe Yoda is the first one. We're going to set this to the second one we can make as Obi-Wan. Set the third one to Darth Maul maybe. And last but not least, Darth Vader. Great. Now that that's done, let's just close out this method, put in the colon, and Command S to save it. Great. So that's done with the Viewdidload method. We need to keep moving. We'll scroll down. We see there's nothing much here in the Viewdidunload method. Now then we eventually run across this method called insert new object. And again, this is, if you remember, the original application allowed us to insert rows on the fly. We're not doing that, so we can actually just technically just comment out or remove this whole block of code. I am going to go ahead and comment it out. So that's done there. Do Command S to save. Now we're getting into some of the table view methods. You'll notice, of course, one of the first ones is the number of sections in table view. Required method, that's in there. We've set it to 1 currently. Next, we're going to see that there is a table view method called number of rows in section, and this is also required. And you'll notice that it's returning a value of objects.count. Now, where is this value coming from? If you scroll all the way back to the top of this file, you'll notice that we have created an NS mutable array called objects, and this is because we were initially, Apple was in its default code giving us a table view application that could be modified where you could add and remove rows. So we're not going to be using that operation, so we'll go ahead and remove this. Plus we've also created our very own NSArray object, and that's really what we want to use. Now if we scroll back down, you'll notice that by commenting that out, I've immediately generated 4 errors, and that's because there's probably references to that particular NS mutable array down in our code, and it's going to throw those errors until I actually fix them. So let's keep going. We were, if you remember, right here, we were in this particular method, and we were trying to return the number of items or a count of the number of items in the array rather than specifying a specific amount. Now, because this is a simplistic application, I could always just do return 4. and that would fix the error, but that's not quite what I want to do. What happens if I enter additional values here? That's not going to be of any help to me, and I really want this to be computed automatically. So I'm going to hit Command Z and restore it back, and still the error. And what we want to do, instead of using the objects variable, we want to use our NSArray, and which was called, if you remember, list. So I just changed that to list, do Command S, and that error disappears. So that's the count we're going to get. It will still be 4 because that's how many objects we've got in there. Right, so let's keep going down the list. You'll notice here we are at the method that's called TableView self row at index path. Now here we've got a couple things going on. If you've looked at my TableView tutorial, you'll know that one of the things it's doing is it's creating a cell, and then it's attempting to reuse it, so that way you're not basically creating objects for no reason. So if in a table view, as you know, you can scroll up or down if you've got items. As it rolls off the field, Objective-C is smart enough to basically grab a cell that's already been created and just simply insert the new values into it, rather than creating thousands of these objects. So as we scroll down, you'll notice here that there's some code that is throwing an error, and one of it is this particular line. It says NSDate, and it's creating an NSDate object, and then it's basically trying to insert that or set that value to whatever object is at the current index path.row, the current row that we're looking at. So you'll notice that the problem is we're once again referring to the value that was in that object's NS mutable array. Now if you remember, we've commented that out so we can no longer use it, but at the same time we also don't really want to create a NSDate object. So what we're actually going to end up doing is commenting out just about all of that code. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm just going to use a block comment and get rid of all of it. So we just comment all of that out. We can leave the return cell line in there because we're going to need that. So what do we need to do from here? Well, one of the things we want to do is we want to set the text property of our cell to whatever it is that we're currently looking at in the array. So we can do that by using very similar code to what's already up there. So we're going to go cell.textLabel, and we access its text attribute and say set that value to be whatever it is you're looking at, which is going to be, in this case, list. So underscore list, there we go. And we're going to say we want you to set it to the object at index, and it's looking for an unsigned integer, and we're just going to set it to index path dot row. Command S. So what this is going to do, of course, is set our value to set that text value to whatever it is we're currently looking at in our list array. So why is it throwing an error? Well, it's because I have not really set this up correctly. This needs to be an uppercase L. Do a Command S, and there we go. That's set. Next, we run across this method, which is TableView can edit row at index path. Well, we don't really need that method, so we're going to comment that out as well. We could have very easily just changed this value to be no, like it says in the comment, but we're not. Since we don't really need it, I'm going to remove it. And our next method has also got a couple errors, but if you look at the method name, you're going to notice that again it's got editing involved in it, and again, since we're not really doing that, we can technically comment this out as well, which is what we're going to do. So let me go ahead and remove this multi-line comments trailing slash, and then paste it below this here, do a save, and you'll notice that we've counted brought our errors down to just 2 now. And as we keep going, we're going to see that there's a couple more methods that are available. So this last method is sort of key to the whole navigation controller process. The method's called TableView did select row at index path. So this is the method that actually does something when you tap a particular row. So you'll notice that there's some code in here that's basically checking to see if we're looking at the view controller is loaded. If it's not, then it basically allocates one, and then creates it. So we're going to change a lot of the code that's in here, and again you'll notice that it makes reference to an NSDate object. This is all just code because of the fact that it was inserting timestamps. So we're going to remove most of this and make it much simpler. So let's just comment all of this out real quick, and we'll leave all of the lines except this particular last one commented up. So here we go. So instead of including this, what I'm going to do is just declare a new detail view controller object, and we'll call that particular object maybe something as simple as I don't know, DVC. Alright, so let's just do this. Let's say we're going to create an instance. There's my keyboard malfunctions. Alright, here we go. Detail view controller. We're going to call it DVC, and then we're going to say what we want you to do is basically create a detail view controller. In fact, if I'm being lazy, I could just technically copy this code from here, do a Command C, paste it, and that gives me a nice detail view controller object, and I get a warning because I haven't used it yet, and that's just fine. Once that's done, what I want to do is come back down here. If you remember, we had created an instance variable in our detail view controller called, I believe it was item number. So let me go ahead and let's just double check that here. Yep, ID detail item. Oops, and actually that looks like a step I probably missed. So I created the picture. Let's go ahead and create one more property. And this is, once again, if you're following along, I jumped back to our detail view controller.header file, and I'll tell you why I'm creating this in just a second here. We don't want to use any of the strong or non-atomic because we're just wanting to create an integer variable here, and we'll just call it maybe item number. Let's do Command S and save it. Don't forget to do your @synthesized as usual. Scroll back up and go to @synthesize. And this is going to be item number. We'll just say, do the same drill as before. Number, do a Command S. Right, so now if we jump back to our master view controller implementation file and go back to that line that we wanted to add, what I want to do here is when our code or when the compiler reaches this line, I want it to first of all create this detail view controller. And once it's done with that, or really in no particular order, I want it to also reach in and modify that particular instant variable's value. And I can do that because I now have this view controller called DVC. So I might say something like DVC dot, I can reach out to the item number. This is because we had those setter and getter set up, and I can set that to be equal to the index path.row value. Now, why do I want this? It's because I want to be able to later on do a comparison between what the item numbers are and then basically affect the image view. So what I'm doing here is essentially allowing myself a way to know which particular row the user tapped on the first view controller or that first screen with a table view, and then use that value to perform some logic and say, well, if you tap row 1, show X, if you tapped row 2, show Y. And we'll see that in just a second here. But so I'm going to go ahead and set this value. That's done. The last step here is I actually have to go back into this last line and I have to change this push view controller value. So you'll see that it's currently set to self.detail view controller. Well, we want to just change this to be DVC, which is the name of our detail view controller object. So we do that, we do a Command S, and we should be all set as far as this particular block of code. So if you've never dealt with navigation controllers before, one thing to sort of remember about how they work is, if you can imagine, there is within your application something called a window. This window might have multiple view controllers underneath it. So the first view controller that we actually see is the table view, and that is generated using this master view controller file. When we want to see the detail view controller, although it looks like it's transitioning to the left, what it's actually doing is pushing another view controller onto the stack. And if you want to think of a sort of an everyday scenario where you could see that, is think about when you're in the cafeteria and you've got stacks of trays. So what's happening there is every time the compiler reaches this line, what it's doing is, if you can imagine, it's adding another tray onto the top of the stack, which is this new view controller called the detail view controller. And Of course, the way a stack works, if you were looking at the stack, what would you see first? You would see the detail view controller on top, and that's why you can see that detail view. What happens when you are navigating through a navigation controller based application is when you hit the back button, that view controller is popped off the stack, and all that really means is that top controller is removed, and then you see the controller below it, which would of course be the master view controller. So that in a sense is how these view controllers work. So now that we've got these in place, we actually have to now switch over to our detailed view controller implementation file, and we're going to add some code to make use of this item number value, and therefore conditionally sort of determine what image is going to show up in that view controller. And that's what's going to also allow us to use the same view controller file to essentially display the 4 different images and the 4 different names that are there. So that's where we're sort of leveraging this particular item number value. So let's get started doing just that. One of the last things we're going to want to do is make use of this item number instance variable and use that value to really determine what needs to be displayed in the UI image view that we have in our detailed view controller. So let's flip back to the implementation file for our detailed view controller, and we're going to zip back to the configure view method. Right. So over here, let's make some space. And one of the first things we're going to want to do, of course, is import the images that we're going to use within our image view. So the way we do that, of course, is I usually try and group all those items together within the project. So I'm just going to create a new group, and I'm just going to call that images. And then I am going to right click and add files to this project. Now I've already downloaded some files and have them on my desktop. Here we are, and I'm just going to select them all using Command A, and then just click the add button, and it gets added to our project. And because I had already had the images folder selected, it gets added into that folder nicely, so that's great. They can also, of course, be in the root of the project if you're not really into doing these multiple subfolders. I know that sometimes it gets a little hard to track what's in each of them. So you can either use this method or just put them in the root of the project. Alright, so once we've got that there, what we need to do next is create a couple image or UI image objects, and that's because when you want to basically set the UI image view's image property, you have to set it to a UI image object. So let's first of all create a couple UI image objects. So let's just say create the UI image objects. We're going to go ahead and do that, and we just do something like UI image, and we'll call it let's say the first one was Yoda image, and then we are going to create a UI image. Whoop, I didn't mean to do that. Alright, let's try this again. UI image called Yoda image, and we are going to do a UI image, and it'll be image named, and that's the method we want, and it'll be set to an NSTring value, which is really just the name of the file. So in this case it'll be yoda.jpg. Command S and save it, and you'll see that it's throwing a warning. That's okay. It's simply because we haven't used this particular UI image object yet. So I'm just going to do Command C and do a Command V to paste it, and of course I have to change these because otherwise it'll throw an error saying it's a redeclaration. We'll call this one ob1 image, and of course this file I happen to know is called ob1.jpg. Do that again, and this time we're going to call it mall image. That's Darth Maul, and I know that we've got a file called mall.jpg. Last but not least, we need one for .vader, and so we're just going to call this Vader image, and it's going to be an image named Vader.jpg. Right, so we've got our UI image objects. We've got 4 warnings, of course, because we haven't used them. So what we need to do now is, remember what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to use this one detailed view controller file and then basically display stuff in the view controller itself based on whatever value we're getting for this particular property, which is the item number. And this is where it's going to come into play. So I'm going to use a switch statement. A switch statement is probably one of the best ways to do comparisons. You do need an integer to be able to do it. And I can very easily use this property because I know it's going to get passed in, which is item number. And I can, let me see here. Usually indentation is not a problem, but let's see here. Right, so by using the switch statement, essentially I can pass in a value to this switch block, and it'll check the different cases. And if you've never seen them before, this is how it looks. So case, the expression value, this would be case 0, because remember our arrays start at 0. And then we're going to put in the code that we want to execute, right? So we're going to say one of the things that we want to be able to change is that label. So let's just say detailed description label, and we're going to change its text property, and we're going to set it to a string. We're just going to make one up. We'll say in case 0 we want it to be Yoda. Command S to save. Next we're going to come back down and say, do you remember we have a property here called picture, or this is a Uiimageview. So we want to set that Uiimageview's image property. Here we are. So we go picture dot image, and we're going to now set it to this UI image that we created earlier. So all we have to do is set that to Yoda image, and it knows what we're looking for. Do a command S to save. Then we're going to also want to modify the title of the view, so we'll just say self.title, and we're going to set that to the same NS string as above. We're just going to call it Yoda. And we of course have to put in a break statement, otherwise it'll keep executing every single case. Right, so that's case 0. Now we can go ahead and add our next case. That's going to be, and I'm getting an error simply because of the fact that I have, two cases with the same number. So I'm going to switch this to case 1. I'm going to set this value to now be OB1. I'm going to set the image, of course, to be the OB1 image, and I'm going to change the title to be OB1 as well. Very good. So I'm going to keep doing that. That's case 1, so this needs to be case 2. We're going to set this to be .mol. Set this value to be mol image. Change this again. And then we've got one more case to work on, which is case 3. And if you're, of course, wondering why we're going from 0 to 3, remember all our values are stored in an NS array. And in an array, the index value, or the index number that for each array location starts at 0. So that's why we've got to go case 0 through 3, even though we've got 4 items. And let's see here, we want this one to say Darth Vader. We're going to change this to say Vader image, and we'll change this a little as well. Darth Vader. Great. Now you might notice, or if you've worked with switch statements before, you know that you do have the option to include a default case, but it's not required. So I'm going to go ahead and just leave that off for now. It's usually good practice to include it in case you want it to show up as default. So, or maybe we'll just go ahead and do it real quick here. I'm just going to come down here, remove that, and just change that to default. Move the extra colon there. There we go. Okay, so now by default it's going to show the Yoda image. Right, so I think we've got most of our stuff set up here. I am going to now stop this application. Looks like I already had it running in the background, which is no problem. And I'm just going to rebuild it and then have it run in our simulator. And let's see what we get. So it's taking a couple seconds to build here, and just about done. And here we are. Got it loading up in the simulator. And here we go. So we've got our table view with the 4 characters that we added in. We've got a detail disclosure indicator, which is to the right. And now if I click on Yoda, I'm seeing that I get the title and I get this particular value, but I get no image. So let's see if it's true for the other ones as well. Yeah, we're getting the values just fine. And so what's wrong here? So let's try and figure out why we're not actually seeing the image itself. So a couple things we can do, of course, is let's check our detail view controller.nib file, make sure everything's hooked up correctly. Let's right click it. So that's our problem. We created the image view, but we never actually hooked it up to our IB outlet. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and hook it up. And remember that our IB outlet instance variable is called picture. Do that. And now that we've got that in place, I can do a Command S. And I'm going to go ahead and stop this and rebuild the project. Get the simulator back on screen, so see if it loads up here. Okay, so now once again we've got this. Now when I click on Yoda, there we go, there's our picture. We can now see the same is true for all the other characters as well. I click on them and I get the images and I get that text that I was setting as the label. So there we have it. That's our simple Star Wars application, but it's also a navigation based application where you've got initially a table view and you've got various items in that table view. We've already covered how to do table views before, and then when you click on the item in the table view, it loads up a detail view controller in which there's an image that's specific to the item that was just clicked on, and the text. The label here displays the character's name, and you see that we've also been able to set the title to that as well. Now, one last item I want to mention before we end this tutorial, of course, is this idea of automatic reference counting. So you'll know that in the past, let's take a look at one of our view controller files. Anytime you create an object, so let's find an example here real quick. This may not be the best file to look for it in. Let's go back to our master view controller. Right. So normally, anytime you create an object like a detail view controller and you use this particular property called alloc, you're supposed to also be responsible for releasing it. So we might probably put in a line of code right after this that says DVC release or something like that. With automatic reference counting, that is no longer necessary, because in the past it's actually been a little bit tricky to remember whether or not you should release an object. You release one too early, you cause problems. You don't release it in time, you may cause a memory leak. So automatic reference counting takes all that work away from you. That also means you can't actually enter things like DVC release, or for that matter, retain. None of these statements will be permitted. So if I do this and I do a Command S, you notice that it immediately throws an error. It says no visible for the selected release. So you are basically no longer allowed to release your objects if you have checked the ARC, or the automatic reference counting option, when you first created this project. So that is something that you're going to see. It also shows up if you've looked at your property declarations. You might remember that in the past, when you declared a property value, you actually did it as add property, non-atomic, retain, and then IB outlet, whatever the instance variable that you're creating. Well, what happened to the retain? Well, the retain is one of those commands where you're essentially asking to increase the retain count for a particular object, saying that you're going to be using it, so don't release it until you reduce that value. Well, you don't need to do that anymore, so that's why we've switched to this strong. And non-atomic, as usual, strong of course just says that this is this particular object belongs to this class. So that's it in terms of automatic reference counting. I really hope that this project, as we've created it, even though it's simplistic, it gives you a good idea of how you can set up these navigation controllers with these detail view controllers, and how easy it is to do it with the new template, as long as you know what you're looking to remove. You can of course start off with the original template and look at some of their more advanced code that shows how you can insert values right on the fly into your table view. So I hope this was helpful. I know this is a little bit of a long tutorial, but I will catch you next time. Thank you.